Doorbell at 3 a.m. Marriage at the Brink. I live in Sacramento, just east of the downtown grid where Midtown bleeds into the old tree-lined streets and the light from the restaurants reflects off frame-polished asphalt. It sounds romantic to say I live in Midtown, but in practice it means a second-floor apartment with creaking floors over a perpetually humming deli, an alley that never quite smells like anything you want to name, and a view of the roofs where pigeons hold town halls at dawn. 8 years of marriage has a way of shrinking and expanding the view depending on the season. We built a family here, at least I believed we did. 2 kids who look most like me in the morning and most like their mother when they laugh. The older is 7 and has a habit of sorting colored pencils by shade. The younger is 4 and thinks Folsom Lake is the ocean because the waves at the shore when the wind blows convince him that everything bigger than the tub qualifies as a sea. On weekends, when work allowed, we would drive up Folsom Boulevard, cut across to the lake, and make a ceremony of crumbly sandwiches and sticky grapes. The kids would throw pebbles at the water as if inviting it to throw something back, and I would play the game of inventorying our lives. In my head I listed the shipping labels waiting in the printer tray, the partially sanded baseboards in a client's hallway, the e-commerce return requests, the pending estimates, the account balances I kept leaning away from like a person stepping from a heat source that is still invisible but definitely there. I run a small business that dances on 2 floors at once, online sales that never sleep and home renovation that never rushes. Cash flow behaves like a vacationing cat, around when you least expect it and missing when you most need it. It used to be a challenge I welcomed. Lately it has started to feel like a judgment. My father had a stroke in late spring. He is a stubborn man who never forgave his body for its betrayals. The hospital near the river stabilized him, then a rehab facility surrounded by lawns that looked like expensive haircuts chiseled at twice weekly rates. The bills didn't dribble in, they marched. Insurance was a patchy blanket. I swiped what I could from my own savings, deferred things you are not really supposed to defer, and watched the electric bill redden around the edges. I told myself this is what you do for parents who taught you how to ride a bike on a street without sidewalks and how to patch drywall with the patience of a monk. My wife said she would pick up extra ICU shifts to close the gaps. She works nights, so she prefers the rhythm of the hospital when the outside world shuts down. She described the alarms as a kind of music. I nodded and added up hours and gratefully did not look too closely at the math because gratitude needed to come first. Red flags never arrive in colors bright enough to name. They start as small administrative anomalies that you tell yourself could just be life being messy. I noticed lift receipts on our shared email that didn't align with her stated end times. Rides at 1:20 a.m. when she was supposed to clock out at 7 a.m., then rides to places that looked like she was bouncing around Midtown before coming home. There were charges that ended on a cross street near the river, not the hospital entrance, and a couple that finished in Rancho Cordova near a cluster of storage facilities and auto shops. She said she often got assigned to different units at the last minute. She said security preferred staff to use rideshares instead of parking in the employee lot after midnight because of break-ins. She said a lot of things that I filed under plausible because in crisis you pick your battles and the rent refuses to debate. One morning she left the apartment in a rush and returned 10 minutes later saying she left a necklace in a locker at work the night before and needed to change her scrubs because the zipper broke. The necklace was new and shiny and would have looked out of place even inside of a jewelry store's lighting. I asked when she got it and she gave me a story about a staff appreciation perk from a vendor that didn't really make sense, but felt gentle enough to accept. I had a shipment to drop at the post office and a client expecting my Sando to meet his baseboards. I let it go and drove away rehearsing optimism. You can't force an unraveling into schedule, but sometimes it cooperates. I had recently installed a doorbell camera after someone tried a car door in the alley. I'm a cautious spender because I don't get to be anything else, but I justified it as inventory protection for packages. Weeks later, my phone pinged at 3:11 a.m. on a Thursday while I was asleep. I missed it because sleep is pulling hard. At 7:45 a.m., sipping coffee that tasted like a stubborn argument, I scrolled and saw her coming up the stairs, moving like someone trying to silence a moving staircase. She looked over her shoulder, tucked into the door, carefully bypassed the squeak by stepping closer to the wall, and disappeared inside with a bag I hadn't seen before. I watched the clip twice and felt my chest turn into a door I couldn't open. She had told me she was still at the hospital because the trauma case required extra hands. The timestamp did not allow charity. I waited until the kids were at school and daycare. I couched it as a check-in and asked about the extra hours. She slid into a story about staffing shortages and how the hospital is a world apart where numbers made sense only to nurses and God. I described the video without embellishment. She blinked once and created a new narrative, something about a rideshare mix-up and needing to come home to grab a missing badge, then needing to get back fast. None of it squared with the casual movement in the video or with the bag. Yelling is not my climate, but my voice raised itself because the air had gone stale. She countered by saying my business stress had turned me into a suspicious person. She said she was drowning in work and our finances and my father's situation, and needed me to be a partner who doesn't pick apart her nights like a prosecutor. I heard myself apologize even as a part of me stood in the corner and watched the apology enter the room like a stranger. It would be neat to say that was the moment I woke up, but my loyalty to our family is a muscle that tries to work even when the limb is broken. I tried to fix things. I tried to offer solutions like shifting some weekend hours so I could handle more pickups and drop-offs so she could sleep between shifts so the kids would feel the routine settle back into place. She listened and nodded and withdrew into her phone in a way that made the wall behind her feel more compassionate than I did. That weekend I drove the kids to Folsom Lake alone. I told them their mother was catching up on sleep because she was helping people all night. I threw pebbles at the surface and tried to throw back the ache. The wind lifted tiny waves and the little one clapped as if the lake had applauded him. The following Wednesday the older one came home with a form from school for a dental screening program that included a genetic consent line I did not sign. I saw my signature there anyway. It was a perfect imitation of my slanted R, a way I tilt the final stroke at a small angle till it decisively finished. The date was in her handwriting. I felt like a person standing in their own living room and noticing the picture frames are an inch to the left. A week after that, the bank called to verify a home equity line application. I told the representative that no such application existed. He read back the details and I heard my name attached to a new address I didn't recognize and monthly obligations I couldn't carry. The bank had flagged it for an in-person identity check, which is the only reason they were calling. I drove there immediately and asked to see what they had. The file contained a photocopy driver's license that could have passed at 5 feet and a signature that won a competition for impersonation. I was told I would need to open a fraud case. I was told this happens more often than it should. I was told the law will sort out the facts. I tried to breathe and went home with the folder of photocopies and a headache that felt engineered. She was not home. Her mother called later that evening to say Anna had taken an extra shift, her voice smooth in the way of people who work hard at smoothing because they are hiding a whole set of angles. Her mother has always been equal parts sweet and tutorial, a person who will bring you soup and simultaneously tell you it is a miracle her daughter settled for you. She said she would pick up the kids from daycare to let me handle my jobs. I thanked her because manners are reflex even when suspicion is at a boil. In the days that followed, I searched our mail, our shared drive, the cloud of our life where receipts drift like leaves. I found a credit card statement for an account I didn't know existed with charges that did not belong to our budget, a boutique jewelry store on a street near the river where the winters are designed to make you feel poor, a fine dining restaurant in a building that used to be a bank, late night rise, and monthly payments to a storage facility in Rancho Cordova. The unit number was a set of numbers that fit in my head like a code I should have known sooner. I printed it because paper helps me believe what pixels still let me deny. I drove there alone on a Friday, telling myself I was headed to a supplier for cabinet hardware in the same area. The facility smelled like cardboard and Freon. The manager checked that I was on the authorized list, which apparently I was, and led me past rows of doors that looked like teeth. Inside the unit I found a small life arranged with polite intentions. There was a plastic bin of kids' art, a shoebox of old ticket stubs and hospital armband, and a duffel containing a burner phone, receipts folded into origami guild, a wad of cash bound in a rubber band I recognized from our kitchen drawer, and a Ziploc bag holding copies of documents I thought only existed as originals in our apartment. There was also a folder with a color printout of the home equity line application and a checklist that made me feel like a task on someone else's to-do list. I slid down the inside of the door and listened to my pulse. I turned on a burner phone. It had one of those pay-as-you-go balances and a message thread with a label that used only initials. The thread was filled with coordination that read like a plan dressed up as logistics. It detailed rides after shifts, an apartment near the river where parking is always a hassle, and weekends said to be pre-booked for overtime but marked with the address of a condo on a side street I knew from running errands. Some messages referenced my mother-in-law as if she were dispatch, saying when she would cover bedtime, when she would text me that extra hours were killing her daughter and we had to be understanding. In the receipts I found movie tickets and a weekend reservation at a hotel in Old Sacramento during a time I had believed our marriage was marching through another routine month. I wanted to throw the whole unit into a fire, but I also wanted to assemble every piece into a diagram that could convict a person in open court. The folder contained an insurance letter congratulating Anna on adding a supplemental life insurance policy for a dependent. The dependent name was our younger child. There was a beneficiary line with a name I did not recognize. There was also a lab printout from a pediatric visit that I vaguely remembered, a routine check that included a genetic marker test for a medication sensitivity. The test flagged a probability that the child's paternal lineage did not match what the intake form claimed. It was phrased like a statistical caution, the kind of medical language that hedges while snapping your spine. The pediatrician had recommended follow-up testing if the parents wished to confirm lineage for future medical decisions. I had never seen this letter. I stared at the page until the text looked like instruction labels on a bomb. I drove back to the apartment and sat in the car listening to the neighbors' chihuahuas treat the air like a defendant. I walked upstairs and tried to make dinner while thinking about whether dinner matters when your home is a scene. The kids watched something in the living room and shouted the names of cartoon characters without knowing they were building a soundtrack for an interrogation I could not do. When she came home, she moved around the kitchen like a surgeon sterile to her own house. I told her I had discovered the storage unit and her body went still in the way that predators use before pouncing. She accused me of snooping, of violating boundaries, of being possessive. She said the storage unit was for sentimental items and emergency cash, which was insultingly true in the most distorted way. She said she had opened a life insurance policy to make sure the kids would be okay if something happened at work. She said the beneficiary was a placeholder. She said a lot of weaponized vagueness. I mentioned the bank call. I told her the signature on the HELOC was the best copy of me I had ever seen. She pivoted into fatigue and mentioned burnout and said she was trying to find ways to stabilize us because my business was always one client away from interesting and one slow month away from catastrophic. She said her coworkers were doing what they had to do, picking up side gigs, driving after shifts, sleeping whenever sleep could be convinced to attend. The mention of driving after shifts made something click. The name on the lift receipts had repeated. I had assumed it was coincidence or a driver who worked the night shift. The burner phone had a photo in his gallery of him in a hospital parking garage wearing scrubs and a driver's cap, a custom editor uniform. He was one of her coworkers. He had added rideshare to his work because the side income made the difference between his kids' music lessons and no lessons, according to a text where he complained about gas prices. There was a picture of the two of them taken from the angle of people who believe they exist inside a bubble. Their faces were close enough to make proximity look like a language. I confronted the fact of it as a fact and not as a suggestion. She attempted to split hairs thin enough to count as denials. She said he gave her rides because the lot felt unsafe. She said they were friends. She said I was inventing betrayals because I hate feeling financially small and needed a way to make her smaller with me. She did not react to the pediatric test printout beyond a shrug so grotesque I felt embarrassed for the anatomy it required. She extracted her mother from her phone like a lawyer retrieving a witness. Her mother called, voice syrupy and sharp, and said I was tearing the family apart over things I did not understand. She used the word ungrateful and it landed like a slap. I left the apartment and walked until I got to the river. Tower Bridge glowed like a stage prop conveniently illuminated to make you feel like a person in a movie. I pressed my palms into the railing and thought about blood types, recessive traits, and the idea that a whole child could be built on a question mark that had been kept from me as if I were not one of the adults in the room where decisions are made. I couldn't stop seeing the kids on the lakeshore throwing pebbles as if they were granting wishes. The next days were a choreographed wreck. I called a lawyer recommended by a client who had once described his divorce as an education that cost more than graduate school. I explained what I had found and the lawyer slowed me down to first principles. He suggested that I freeze what I could freeze, pull my credit reports, alert the bank's fraud department in writing, and retrace every signature I could find. He said I needed documentation, not speeches. He said I needed to consider a paternity test for medical clarity, even if I did not know yet what to do with such information. He said I needed to avoid giving her any reason to accuse me of tampering with mail or devices. He told me to take screenshots, make paper copies, and talk like a person who expects an audience of strangers later. I'm not built for espionage, but I learned fast. I pulled copies of everything I could access legally. I downloaded the Doorbell archive and saved it in 3 places. I printed the storage unit inventory with dates I could tie to the ride receipts and the hotel reservation. I photographed the forged consent on the school dental form and wrote down how I knew it wasn't mine. I called the pediatrician and scheduled an appointment to discuss the genetic letter, phrased as a follow-up to clarify how to proceed. They spoke politely and carefully and told me that confirmatory testing could be done with cheek swabs and that results would be clinical, but not legal in some contexts. The word clinical thudded in my chest like a stamp. One afternoon, the 7-year-old mentioned the driver by first name while drawing a map of our neighborhood in different colored pencils. It was not said as an accusation or meant to injure. It was offered as a fact about adults who drive cars that smell like pine. I swallowed something metallic and asked an innocent question about how this person fit into the picture. The child said he was the safe driver that takes mommy home when she has to save people all night. There was pride in his sentence and confusion in its echoes inside my head. I felt the fault line in our living room. The next twist came from a direction I did not expect. A friend I had confided in called to ask if I had confronted Annie yet. I said it was messy and moving and I was trying to do it the least catastrophic way possible for the kids. He told me he had run into a nurse he used to date who worked at the same hospital and had overheard a conversation in the cafeteria that sounded like a rehearsal. Apparently my wife's coworkers knew at least the outline of the situation. The rideshare coworker was separated from his own wife and partly living in a short-term rental near the river. The part I didn't want to hear was that my mother-in-law had been a regular at the hospital's family lounge, bringing cookies, playing the martyr to an audience that didn't ask for tickets, and covering for schedule anomalies with the ferocity of a coach. The friend admitted he had told someone to warn Anna that I was digging because he thought he was preventing a scene. I hung up feeling like I accidentally hired my own saboteur. Evidence started to disappear. The burner phone thread thinned as if a vacuum had passed through it. The storage unit calendar updates switched to cash payments logged in sloppy penmanship. The bank emailed to say the Hello fraud case had been escalated because the same applicant had tried to update the address again. I told myself it could be an identity thief using Anna's cover and that I needed to consider that someone outside had targeted us. I tried on that comforting lie for a few minutes until it did not fit. A follow-up pediatric appointment, the doctor described the genetic marker letter as a statistical outlier that warranted clarity. He spoke in that precise tone physicians use to hold both empathy and distance at once. He suggested we consider a paternity test not as a tool of blame but as an instrument of medical truth because certain medications interact with genetic profiles in ways that you want to know about before you need to. I nodded and felt my mouth say the words ordering a kit. I did it because I am a father and the job sometimes requires walking through a wall you do not want to acknowledge exists. In parallel, my father's rehab dragged his once stubborn frame into exercises he would have marked a year ago. I spent afternoons counting his steps in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic generosity and cloves. He gripped my arm and complained about the indignity of learning to button a shirt twice. I watched the therapist coax his fingers back into cooperation and thought about how hands can relearn what betrayal stole from them. On the drive back across town, I would pass the hospital where my wife worked and study the windows for silhouettes. I told myself I was asking God for mercy, but really I was just calculating how many lives fit into a single commute. When the paternity kit arrived, it felt like contraband. I followed the instructions with the attention of a person diffusing something that cannot be diffused. The swabs felt like trespassing. The waiting period felt engineered to teach humility. While I waited, I compiled a binder thick enough to hurt the hands, labeled tabs like a person auditioning for a part in a procedural. I added an insurance advisory about the supplemental policy, the life insurance beneficiary sheet with the misery name, the bank's fraud case numbers, the school's consent form photocopy, the storage unit's roster of items, and a printout of rideshare receipts with addresses highlighted in yellow that made my stomach feel fluorescent. I finally confronted the coworker because self-respect sometimes requires a strategy that looks like stupidity. He was outside the hospital one morning, leaning against the concrete as if gravity had given him permission. He recognized me and his face went through a sequence of calculations that ended in practiced calm. I did not shout. I described the damage in a voice heavy enough to dent metal. He moved between contrition and deflection like a person who learned both in the same workshop. He said things without saying them, implied duty, implied friendship, implied martyrdom to our financial situation, all without giving me anything I could stake a legal claim on. The security guard watched us like a referee tired of the sport. I walked away with nothing but a sense that I had met a person who had been living inside my house without physically being there. The paternity result arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the hour when fatigue starts to taste like sugar. The clinical language suggested inconclusive leaning away. The probability did not stand on my side. It was not a definitive no stamped in red, but it was not the comfort of certainty I had bought with hormones and 2 years of diaper changes. I stared at the percentages and thought about how numbers can be tyrants. The doctor, when I called later, suggested a more conclusive legal test if I needed certainty beyond medical caution. I held the paper and felt my hands forget what to do with objects. I slept on the floor next to the 4-year-old that night while the hum of the apartment pressed against my eardrums and the neighborhood alley rehearsed its nightly chorus. In the morning, my wife moved through the kitchen with the steadiness of someone who believes their script is stronger than the stage. She announced more overtime and added that her mother would help with pickups. I told her I had retained a lawyer and that we would be structuring the next weeks to protect the kids and the finances. She called me dramatic. She accused me of punishing her for doing what it takes to keep the family afloat when my business had turned into a fluctuating hobby. She said she had been carrying everyone, including my father. She reminded me that she covered co-pays and brought dinner home after midnight and slept in 20-minute segments while the children used her as a trampoline. She made a case for sainthood and I stood in the jury box with paperwork that felt inadequate to try a person you have loved. The lawyer filed preliminary paperwork for legal separation because he said it was a way to establish boundaries while we investigated everything else. He requested injunctions against new debts using my name and asked the bank to lock down the Hello channel. He reminded me to document every interaction with dates and times. He encouraged me to consider therapy, not as a luxury but as a life-preserving device. He told me that quotes love timestamps more than tears. My mother-in-law escalated. She started showing up unannounced and delivering monologues about sacrifice and family loyalty as if the living room were a chapel. She positioned herself as the guardian of the children's routine, which on its face was generous and in practice gave her control of when and how I saw my own kids while painting me as the unstable parent. She told neighbors a version of events where I had lost my mind under financial stress and was inventing conspiracies. I found myself explaining to people why I had a folder of photocopies at a backyard barbecue as if I were auditioning for the role of stable man with receipts. A final twist landed on a day already cracked in half. The bank's fraud investigator called to say the HELOC application had used a notary whose seal had been flagged in other investigations. He asked if I recognized the notary. I did. She was the coworker's cousin. The storage unit folder had a flyer for a mobile notary with a number circled and a list of services including loan signings and last-minute appointments. The investigator sighed the sigh of men who spend their days walking across carpets of ashes. He said this would take time and I shouldn't expect a movie ending where truth clears the room like a siren. I learned the rideshare coworker had a wife who was pregnant and living temporarily with her parents in the foothills. The story was that he had separated to figure himself out, which is a euphemism that restaurants should print on menus. The wife reached out to me indirectly through a message that could have been a trap or could have been solidarity. She said she had found receipts and screenshots that sounded like my binder wearing a different jacket. She said her family urged her to focus on the baby and not dive into the swamp. I sat with that, the idea that our stories were now braided whether we liked it or not. At some point the health scare portion of my confession rotated from numbers on paper to a sensation in the body. I had chest pain in the lumber aisle of a hardware store while choosing between two types of baseboard that would change nothing except the price by 50 cents per foot. The panic started as a disagreement between my rib cage and my heart, then travelled up my neck. I drove myself to urgent care, half certain this would be how my story ended, with some doctor telling my wife she could put my name on forms without needing to copy my signature. Tests came back with the bland cruelty of normal. The doctor suggested stress, sleep, hydration, and a counselor who could translate the noise of my days into sentences I could live with. I nodded the way people nod when they recognize that humans run on more than willpower. The therapist's office near Sutter's campus smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. I laid out my ledger of betrayal and tried not to make a closing argument. She listened and asked questions that felt unfairly gentle. She framed my choices as 3 doors: attempt reconciliation with truth as the entry fee, proceed with separation while centering the kids and the stale romance of fairness, or remain in suspended animation and let entropy do the deciding slowly. She said none of the doors were clean. She said the child's paternity question removed the possibility of pretending that the ground under our kitchen table had not changed. She said one can be a father and also suffer the facts. She said a person can love children who may not share their blood without diminishing their love, while simultaneously taking legal steps to protect one's future. She said I could hate 2 truths at once and still pick the path that fed the least amount of long-term bitterness. I drove to Folsom Lake alone at dawn on a Sunday. I parked before the day boaters arrived and walked the shore, and she's not built for contemplation. The water was low enough to expose rocks that elements keep hidden. I threw a pebble and pretended I could decide how far it would skip. I thought about my father in rehab, counting steps like currency. I thought about my kids, and the way the older one organizes pencils when life tilts, and the way the younger one still asks if the lake has sharks. I thought about my wife's face in the doorbell camera light and how even in the moment of trespass she moved with the familiarity of home. I hated that my body still recognized her. I am starting the legal process because I cannot live in a house where the signatures are performance and the nighttime arrivals require surveillance to feel awake. The lawyer is measuring time and money and telling me to pace myself as if this were a marathon with snakes at mile markers. I have not filed for divorce yet because my chest tightens at the thought of courtrooms and at the thought of my kids' faces learning what courtrooms mean. I have arranged a plan where finances are partitioned and accounts are monitored. I have asked the school to require in-person signatures for anything that once could be forged by a copy machine and familiarity. I have scheduled a more definitive test for the younger child because medical truth upfronts comfort when an emergency decides to test the blood. I'm documenting without narration when I can, and narrating without theatrics when I must. I confronted my mother-in-law with the facts I could present without incinerating the fragile scaffolding that lets grandparents remain in children's lives. She withdrew into a version of events where she was the guardian and I was the interrupting stranger. I keep my words narrow and my posture open because the kids watch body language the way adults read scripts. I have told my wife we will co-parent under a framework that values schedules and non-interference more than fresh pain. She says I am cold. I say I am busy keeping the floor from breaking. Some afternoons we pull this off and the apartment looks like a neutral zone. Other days the air is a field of invisible mines. Parenting under these conditions is a series of detours that add up to a day that the children will remember as ordinary. That is a skill I did not know I possessed. What I wanted was the kind of ending you can write on a note card and pin to a cupboard labeled lessons. What I have is the slow grind of ambiguity. If the test says what the preliminary numbers suggested, then my role as a father remains exactly the same in the heart and becomes a piece of paper in the eyes of core forms that demand definitions. If the test surprises, I will have spent the summer and fall learning how to live with the knowledge that doubt is another member of the family. If the Hellock fraud case resolves, I will add that to the binder and accidentally become the kind of man who has a binder for the worst parts of his life. If it does not, I will know that my insistence on caution saved us from a hole that would have taken a decade to fill with drywall dust and discounted returns on kitchen hardware. I am writing this like a confession because I want to be free of something I cannot name that sits between my lungs and insists on rating my days. I am not innocent. I ignored small alarms because I believed in our marriage like people believe in foundations they cannot see under floorboards. I let financial stress turn me into a version of myself who was always counting and rarely noticing. I let my father's illness come into the house like a guest who occupies the couches and the hours and consumes oxygen without asking. I am not apologizing for caring for him, but I am admitting that stress is not a private hobby. It moves into your marriage and rearranges the furniture without asking where you want the couch. The love triangle piece is the part that makes the story sound like a cheaper one than I thought I was living. There is the man at the hospital who wears 2 uniforms and uses the word ride like a reusable mask. There is my wife who decided to leave parts of our life in a storage unit with a number that will never leave my head. There's me, a small business owner with a sander and a shipping label printer, failing to keep up with the crisis by applying more work like a bandage. There is my mother-in-law who sees herself as a commander in a war I never agreed to fight. There's the bank that keeps calling me to ask if I'm the kind of person who signs forms while asleep. There is a lawyer who believes in paper and deadlines and the endurable structure of boundaries. There is a therapist who taught me to state facts in the present tense even when the facts feel like dogs I would prefer to chase away. There are 2 children who deserve to remember their childhood as afternoons at the lake and not a series of adult tremors. I am scarred already. Scar tissue feels like a belt tightening around my days. I am less naive and less able to pretend I believe in blunt benefits of the doubt. I am more inclined to set up 2-factor authentication on every part of my life including herb. I have become a man who checks doorbell cameras and counts rides like a mathematician. I am the kind of person who knows storage unit addresses by heart. I am a father who will get down on the floor and build block towers because stability can be borrowed from cheap architecture when the real thing is under review. I am, unfortunately, a man who will answer questions about paternity while pouring cereal. There is no lesson that makes that elegant. I will not write an ending where I hand myself a moral trophy. My wife is not a cartoon villain. She is a person who works in an ICU where the monitors do not forgive mistakes and death is not theoretical. She chose to hold pieces of our life off-site and to impersonate my hand on forms that could break us, and it would make for a cleaner conclusion to say she is only the person. She is also the woman who sang to our kids at 2 in the morning when calls made them into tiny furnaces and who learned how to cut the crust off toast with a flourish. I am not excusing the betrayals. I am naming the mess because the mess is where I live. The legal steps could end with divorce papers that turn our kitchen table into a relic, or they could end with a separation agreement that becomes a timeline we learn to honor, or they could detour into a form of reconciliation that will always live with an asterisk. I do not know. I am going to the lake again next weekend with the kids because the rocks there do not care about court dates and because the wind treats everyone the same. I will bring the same crumbly sandwiches and the same sticky grapes. I will tell the 7-year-old that arranging colored pencils by shade is a practical way to make sense of the world. I will tell the 4-year-old that lakes do not have sharks, and I will allow myself to believe that some waters are exactly what they say they are, even if the people standing at the edge have forgotten how to tell the truth.